According to the South African government's National Historical Site, the Khoikhoi and San peoples were the original inhabitants of the country. The San, like most African tribes, were a hunter-gatherer society. They had no formal chief, operating primarily by group consensus, which is an example of democratic principles early in South Africa. Religiously, the San were polytheistic and revered the moon. Although the San were the indigenous people of South Africa, most black South Africans are actually of Bantu descent. The Princeton University database states that settlers speaking Bantu languages, which refers to over 300 to 600 different ethnic groups, began arriving in the area modern-day known as South Africa around 600 CE. They arrived in waves. According to ZuluCulture.co.South Africa, in Zulu culture, men married multiple wives, making them polygamous. Fathers had little to no contact with their children, and mothers were responsible for childbearing and all traditional household tasks. Children were taught to respect elders unconditionally and not speak unless spoken to. Children were also subject to beatings and other punishments that would be viewed as child abuse today in Western society. It is important to note that prior to colonization, the hundreds of different tribes that lived in South Africa were not united under one government. Colonialism first began in 1652 with the Dutch. The Dutch brought slaves into the country, bringing Africans from other places, but also enslaving Africans that lived in South Africa. According to South Africa History Online, slaves were seen as property, but their human rights were also respected. They were treated as regular human beings with, quote, human values, desires, and emotions. The Dutch also spread Christianity to the tribal nations, with many Bantu speakers adopting Christian names and practicing Christianity instead of their ancestral religions. In 1806, during the Napoleonic Wars, South Africa was transferred into British hands. The British imposed their laws and the English language on South Africans. The British introduced laws aimed at improving the welfare of slaves. However, the ill treatment of African slaves continued to exist during this time period. Slaves were allowed to legally marry in 1824, but only to one person. They were taught Christianity and baptized at birth, leaving their ancestral religions by the wayside. The amelioration laws passed during the colonial era also granted slaves property rights, allowing them to save up earnings and potentially buy their own freedoms. In 1834, slavery was abolished in all British colonies, emancipating slaves in South Africa. South Africa became independent in 1910, establishing a parliamentary democracy. The primary developments in South African law can be viewed through two lenses, one through family law, and the other through laws regarding social status. Families were originally defined without any official laws, because the societies were governed by tribal customs. These customs gave fathers little responsibility over childcare, and men were allowed to marry multiple wives. Polygamy existed without scrutiny until British colonization, where only one wife was legally recognized. Polygamy went without recognition until a law was passed in 1998 and came into effect in 2000, which, according to IOL News South Africa, recognized polygamous marriages. Laws regarding social status also varied throughout South Africa's history. Within tribal laws, people were largely egalitarian, with perhaps a chief having a higher status. Once colonization began, however, the white men forced themselves into a higher position of power, becoming superior over both African slaves and Africans living in the region. These policies continued until after colonization due to apartheid, which you'll hear about this week.
Apartheid in South Africa crumbled after Nelson Mandela walked to freedom, but black people suffered decades of government-backed injustice before it did. Apartheid really began in 1948, but separating black Africans from the white minority had long been a policy aim. Laws made white people officially superior, and the large black majority faced discrimination in every aspect of their lives. Living, doing business or owning land in white areas was banned. There were separate public facilities, transport and schools. Interracial marriage was banned. Many had no right to citizenship and were regarded as aliens in major cities. Instead, they were made citizens of Bantustans, homelands scattered throughout South Africa. But resistance grew. In 1960, a huge peaceful protest against past laws ended in a massacre at Sharpeville. 69 people were killed. The deaths galvanized opposition, radicalizing liberation movements like the ANC.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence.
Open conflict erupted in the 1980s, with anti-apartheid activists frequently shot at, beaten or arrested. Mass protests were firmly put down. But little by little, the apartheid establishment crumbled. After gradual reform, Nelson Mandela, imprisoned since not long after Sharpeville, was set free in 1990. 4 years later, he was elected as South Africa's first black president. Apartheid had ended.
South Africa has been a very prevalent country in the world stage. Because of this, it has had major contributions to global society. Apartheid was one of them. Apartheid was a policy of racial discrimination and segregation used in South Africa from 1948 to 1994. Apartheid impacted world history through its legitimization of racism and prejudiced ideals. This policy of South Africa resulted in many unintended outcomes. First, this policy made the submissive treatment of an entire race of people not only okay, but legal. The impact of this is far-reaching, because in an increasingly global world, other countries struggling to create just systems for race relations could be influenced by South Africa's system. Some countries might see the disparity between whites and blacks in South Africa and use it as a measuring stick to everyone else, to their own country, as a reason to or not to affect change, thinking, well, at least this country's racial problems are worse than ours. The main impact and far-reaching consequences from apartheid stem from its longevity. It lasted for almost 50 years and ended 20 years ago. Apartheid reminded the world that we as a global community are making strides for a better, more accepting future, but still have a long way to go. Unfortunately, South Africa has struggled through many major political issues, one of which is currently very prominent is the issue with poverty and high unemployment rates. According to BBC Africa, there have been many factors blamed for this, including a wave of violent attacks against migrant workers from other African countries in 2008, as well as protests by residents of South African townships over poor living conditions and working conditions in the summer of 2009 within South Africa. Additionally, the BBC article goes on to discuss land redistribution, which is a very hotly debated political topic. Today in South Africa, most farmland is white-owned, and having so far acquired land on a willing buyer, willing seller basis, the South African government hopes to redistribute up to, 30% of the land into the black community of South Africa by the end of 2014. Another hotly debated political issue is corruption. In South Africa, corruption is a very prime concern. It undermines state legitimacy and hinders the government's ability to deliver services, according to leader.co.South Africa and many other sources such as Bram Fleisch and Yusuf Karirodia, who are South African experts, mostly of Dutch ancestry, that spoke of corruption in South Africa today. They describe South Africa as a rudderless, leaderless, drowning in bureaucracy, suffocated by committees, poisoned by rivalries, weakened by corruption, and drained by overpaid and underqualified staff. Clearly then, today South Africa has a very problematic approach towards this, and certain political parties such as the Democratic Alliance in South Africa are basing their entire platforms on resolving corruption within the country and primarily within the government. A lot of state revenues are stolen by private individuals and directed into unknown funds that are then used for private gain. To combat this, the South African government has also begun to create public projects against it, such as the commercial that you're about to see that presents the issue of corruption to the general public of South Africa and hopes to really target their perspective of it and change their mentality to deter it from being something that's well accepted and rather change it to something that is unacceptable and inappropriate within the country.
In a corrupt society, almost anyone or anything can be bought for a price. Whether it's getting off a speeding fine, paying for a service that should be free, buying that tender, or finally getting your driver's license. But consider the real cost. If we stand for nothing, we'll pay for everything. Our future is not for sale. Let's report corruption.